American tank crewmen entered World War II with vehicles that many experts doubted would ever match the fearsome reputation of German armor. The Sherman tank was quick to build, reliable, and mechanically friendly, but its gun looked too small and its armor too thin to the soldiers who first climbed into its cramped interior. Yet inside these olive-drab machines was something almost no one recognized as the decisive weapon of the future. A communications network that stretched across continents, transforming chaos into coordination. The crews didn't think much about the black metal box bolted behind them or the whip-thin antenna rising from the turret. Radios were expected, taken for granted, like steel tracks or gasoline. In reality, those radios were about to change everything. The Germans did not expect their opponents' machines to talk so clearly to each other. When the war broke out, German armored warfare doctrine had been revolutionary. Blitzkrieg wasn't a miracle of tank design. Many early Panzer models were inferior in armor and firepower to their French and British opponents. The German advantage lay in synchronized movement. German tanks talked. They maneuvered like hunting wolves, each vehicle part of a coordinated strike, while many Allied tanks were mute metal brawlers forced to rely on hand signals or shouted orders lost under engine fire. This advantage, combined with aggressive leadership and tactical daring, helped German forces tear through Europe in 1940. But technology lives on a timeline, and while the German radio advantage had shined early, the Americans were quietly working on something far better. In the laboratories of the United States Signal Corps, engineers were grinding away at a problem that plagued battlefield communication worldwide: static. Radios of the early war era used AM transmissions. AM was wonderfully simple, but in a tank battle it was practically a curse. Nearby explosions, engine magnetos, spark plugs, and roaring movement filled the air with interference that flooded the radio channel with screeches and crackling noise. Trying to hear a commander over an AM radio during combat was like trying to listen to a whispered instruction while standing inside a thunderstorm. The Americans had a solution in development years before their tanks arrived in Europe: frequency modulation. FM radio didn't drown in static. Instead, it filtered out much of the electromagnetic chaos of battle. What reached the crew's headphones was a crisp human voice. A tank commander could talk while driving, turning, firing, or fleeing, and the signal would remain strong even miles from the sender. It was a small revolution disguised as a communications upgrade. Inside the Sherman tank, the SCR-508 FM radio system became the nervous system of the American armored force. It wasn't glamorous. No war movie would zoom in on its knobs and switches with heroic music swelling underneath. But it empowered an entire new way of fighting. Every Sherman tank had a radio, and every commander could speak directly to other tanks, to artillery, to reconnaissance units, even to aircraft spotting the movement of enemy vehicles far beyond the next hill. This created a battlefield intelligence network the Germans never fully understood. When American armor first clashed with the German Afrika Korps in North Africa, the Sherman crews looked at the Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks and immediately felt fear. The German commanders were seasoned veterans. Their armor tactics had been tested since Poland and France. Their guns were efficient and deadly. American crews were often new, inexperienced, thrust into a world where death was hidden behind every dune. Communication became not a luxury but a lifeline. Commanders used the radios to warn of enemy ambushes, request artillery fire on German positions, and call reinforcements the moment things went wrong. They could shift an entire company's direction in seconds. They could fix mistakes before they snowballed into disaster. German tank crewman Otto Carius later recalled an encounter that baffled him. He saw American tanks hit one of their own, watched the distant vehicles momentarily halt, then suddenly reorganize their formation perfectly. To him, this seemed uncanny. In the German army, only the platoon leader usually had a radio, and often that leader was very busy firing or commanding under extreme pressure. Most tanks relied on visual cues. If the leader was destroyed, confusion spread like a virus. Radio silence might protect them from detection, but it also left them navigating the battlefield blind. As the war shifted from the deserts of Tunisia to the hedgerows of Normandy, the Americans brought more tanks, improved logistics, and a growing cadre of combat-hardened soldiers. By then, German intelligence officers had begun to notice something peculiar. Every Sherman they inspected after capture or destruction contained a radio. Not just the leader's tank. Not just a few. All of them. This was unprecedented. And the effects multiplied with every engagement. The German Panther and Tiger tanks, marvels of engineering and symbols of Nazi military pride, were built to outshoot and outlast any enemy. Their high-velocity guns ripped through Sherman armor at long distances, and their armor plating could shrug off many American shells. On paper, the Shermans should have been forced to retreat every time. In reality, Panthers and Tigers often found themselves isolated, surrounded, targeted from all sides at once. The advanced German tanks, lacking a full communication network, sometimes wandered into battle like giants who could not hear the cries of their fellow warriors. A Tiger that spotted 3 Shermans might not know there were 6 more maneuvering just over the ridge, receiving instructions from a commander already aware of the German machine's position. Tank warfare is not a duel between machines. It is a dance of coordination, speed, and timing. The Sherman's 25-watt FM transmitter allowed whole platoons to pivot and surround targets the moment an opportunity appeared. When one crew spotted a threat, every tank nearby knew about it instantly. This meant Shermans could plan their own ambushes, create firing pockets, or retreat as a unit instead of dissolving into chaos. German communications officers discovered that their AM signals were often swallowed in the roar of combat. Static, corrupted messages. Words arrived broken or delayed. Sometimes the commander could barely understand his own HQ. Worse, German tank radios occasionally bled into the general battlefield noise, unintentionally broadcasting their plans to listening American crews. The U.S. Signal Corps had trained tank operators to intercept and exploit any German transmissions they could pick up. Even when radio intelligence didn't provide exact positions, it offered hints, warnings, and context. American tankers won more than firefights. They won knowledge. One American after-action report explained how vital that advantage was. In the thick bocage country of France, where fields were boxed in by earthen walls and hidden gun nests, most tanks were destroyed not in open duels but by unseen attackers. A tank without radios had no way to warn its friends. A tank with radios turned every ambush into a temporary setback instead of a sudden massacre. Survival wasn't about being the toughest. It was about being connected. The success of American radio systems was not accidental. The United States invested immense resources into standardized manufacturing. Radios were tested, retested, and built in staggering numbers. Spare parts flowed across the Atlantic in quantities unimaginable to the Germans, who were constantly short on materials like copper wiring and crystals for frequency control. For the Sherman, replacement radios were always available, and crews were trained to diagnose and repair issues in the field. German units often found themselves cannibalizing damaged equipment to keep just one tank communications capable. From Kasserine Pass in early 1943 to the race across France in 1944 and the brutal push into Germany in 1945, the story repeated itself. Every time the Germans thought they had surrounded and trapped American armor, the Shermans changed direction like a school of fish shifting away from a predator. Orders relayed in seconds could counter a breakthrough or launch a coordinated assault on a weak point. German commanders such as Erwin Rommel noted that American battlefield reaction was unnaturally fast. To him, it was strange that an inexperienced force could operate with such tactical clarity. He didn't yet see the invisible threads tying American tanks together. A Panther crew might take cover behind a farmhouse, scanning for targets they believed were nearby. Then suddenly machine gun fire would rake the rear of their hull. A single Sherman had spotted them from a ridge and passed the enemy's location through the airwaves, calling down a storm of steel. The Panther's gun could destroy one tank. But when the Americans moved as a pack, the German machine found itself overwhelmed, knocked out not by superiority in armor or firepower, but by precision in teamwork. German diaries show frustration building through the months of fighting. Commanders complained that their tanks seemed alone in every duel. They requested more radios, stronger transmitters, improved antennas. But by then, the German war economy was falling apart. Strategic bombing, resource shortages, and desperate battlefield losses made upgrades slow and inconsistent. Meanwhile, the Americans were improving their own systems yet again, expanding radio networks to include forward observers, ground attack aircraft, infantry squads, and artillery headquarters. A Sherman crew could now call planes from the sky. Technology had given them wings. Veterans later described how surreal it sometimes felt. They could hear the voices of pilots hunting German armor kilometers away. They could request smoke, he shells, even naval fire support when close to the coast. They had created what modern doctrine calls a combined arms network, a force where each component protects and guides the others. The Germans had once pioneered this idea. Now the Americans executed it on a scale that left the Axis stunned. None of this erased the fear of facing a Tiger tank head-on. Sherman crews still died in enormous numbers, and bravery was demanded every moment. Radios didn't guarantee victory. They offered opportunity. They amplified courage. They turned panic into strategy. In the final years of the war, the American Army proved a principle that would echo into future conflicts. Information beats isolation. A connected force defeats a stronger but deaf one. This was the secret power humming quietly inside every Sherman. Not armor, not gun, not engine. A radio whispering across battlefields, rewriting the very rules of war. As American armored units pushed deeper into Europe, the radio network inside their Shermans became not only a tactical advantage but the backbone of a new way of commanding war. The crew of every tank had someone dedicated to listening, receiving, and sending messages, usually the loader doubling as a radio operator or sometimes the tank commander himself when the situation demanded. While shells screamed and engines roared, voices cut through those sounds with clarity that sometimes felt unnatural in the chaos. It was as if the Sherman had ears that could listen across miles, even while metal clashed against metal. Tank warfare was emotionally crushing. Inside a Sherman, the air smelled like oil, sweat, and cordite. The steel walls vibrated with every bump. The heat could be unbearable. And above all, the constant knowledge that a single shot from the enemy could turn the crew's world into a fiery tomb weighed down their souls. Yet the radio provided an invisible lifeline to a much wider world. A commander's voice, steady and calm, might enter the headphones just when doubt threatened to take over. Orders to flank left. News that friendly infantry had reached a nearby crossroads. Confirmation that artillery was ready to fire smokescreens to cover their advance. No tank was ever alone unless its radio fell silent, and that silence was often more terrifying than the shells screaming outside. The German crews, in contrast, often fought feeling like they were cut off from their own army the moment they lost sight of another tank. An experienced German gunner could send a shell through a Sherman's turret at absurd distances, but even the sharpest aim could not make up for the fact that a panzer without communication was just a piece of metal waiting to be surrounded. A Tiger tank commander could smash through the first wave of attackers, but when the second and third waves flanked out of sight, unseen, unheard, the commander had no one to warn him. Many German veterans later described the way ambushes seemed to materialize everywhere as the war dragged on. American movement was faster, less predictable, but somehow always coordinated. They chalked it up to numbers. They did not understand the role of the radios. Signal Corps officers had shifted entire divisions through the airwaves. They trained tank commanders in brevity codes, precise language, and message discipline. They made sure transmissions didn't clutter channels with rambling speech. These were not random conversations. They were strategic threads weaving units together into something far more lethal than the sum of their armor and guns. One battalion commander described the sensation of directing 20 tanks in real time as like playing chess while running. He could shift a pawn into a position of sacrifice and send his knights charging through the enemy's weak side without ever needing to expose himself to direct danger. German commanders relied heavily on viewports and periscopes, scanning the field personally. The American commander listened, and what he heard mattered more than what his eyes could see. In the thick forests of the Hurtgen, the Germans held terrain that turned every battlefield into a nightmare of close-range fighting. Panthers waited hidden among the trees like steel predators. Sherman after Sherman burned. But the American radios whispered constantly. A tank destroyer unit was rushing up the road. Engineers cleared mines ahead. Infantry secured the high ground. The forest tried to swallow them, but the radio network kept them pulling forward. One German major wrote that every time they thought American momentum had finally died, the enemy surged again with perfect timing. He suspected they had more reinforcements than physically possible. The truth was simply that their tanks worked as a whole, one organism with shared awareness. Even in the Battle of the Bulge, when surprise and weather handed the Germans their last chance at victory, the American radios remained the thin line between collapse and recovery. The bitter cold jammed guns and thick snow smothered movement. German radios struggled under atmospheric distortion and scarce batteries. The Shermans, meanwhile, continued relaying positions even in the worst whiteouts. In snowy darkness, they were guided by voices more than by sight. A young American tank driver remembered crawling through frozen roads, headlights off, relying on nothing but a calm voice on the radio telling them how far to turn and when to halt. Without that, he later said, they would have probably driven straight into the enemy. There were moments when radios saved entire units in seconds. During one clash near Bastogne, a Sherman platoon halted after spotting Tiger IIs advancing through the trees. The Americans knew their shells would barely scratch those behemoths from the front. A brief message transmitted on the net sent nearby tank destroyers into position behind the German machines. What could have been a massacre became a trap sprung against the hunters. The Tigers, mighty and proud, erupted in flames before they understood how their enemy had maneuvered behind them so quickly. Sometimes the radio changed the outcome not by aggression, but by caution. Crews shared the locations of anti-tank guns like whispered secrets. They warned others not to crest a hill where a Panther waited with its gun laid on the exact spot. They called for smoke to blind a sniper who had already taken one life too many. Every warning saved a crew. Every shared observation extended survival. American tankers died in terrifying numbers in 1944 and 1945, but without radios, the graves would have been many thousands more. The more German commanders studied the battlefield, the more they noticed the strange, almost supernatural flow of American movement. It was too fast for messengers, too coordinated for hand signals, too widespread for chance. But by the time the truth was clear, their ability to respond had been shattered by shortages and inflexible doctrine. German engineers tried to improve their tank radios late in the war, but each improvement arrived too little and too late. Their factories could not keep pace, and the battlefield demanded quality in every tank, not just a few. One anonymous German officer wrote a bitter observation in his war diary. They fight like a single creature, like a swarm of insects with one mind. He meant it as an insult, a suggestion that Americans lacked individuality. But the swarm is precisely what terrified German tank aces. An ace can duel another ace. He cannot duel a network of information. A solitary genius cannot outthink 20 soldiers acting as one. American crews often joked about the enemy's obsession with technical superiority. German designers built tanks like cathedrals, magnificent monuments of industry and engineering. But cathedrals do not move fast. They do not adapt. And they do not communicate with one another in the middle of a firefight. The Tiger II was a masterpiece on tracks, but a masterpiece cannot look around corners the way a Sherman platoon could when they shared the same nervous system of FM transmissions. There was irony hidden beneath the rust and wreckage. The Germans had invented modern armored warfare by using radios in every tank. They lost it because they forgot the lesson that mattered. When technology changes, doctrine must change with it. The Americans built an army that talked. The Germans built one that shouted. And on the battlefield, shouting gets drowned out by gunfire. Radio technology also changed the emotional psychology inside the Sherman tank. A commander could talk to his friend in the tank behind him, sharing dark humor or a brief expression of fear before the battle. That small human connection mattered more than historians often give credit. War tries to isolate the soldier, to make him feel small and expendable. Radios reminded them that someone was always on the line with them, someone who cared whether they lived another day. Some veterans recalled how simply hearing another voice kept panic at bay. "We weren't brave," one said. "We were just never alone long enough to break." When a tank was hit, the screams or sudden silence shot across the radio in real time. Crews heard their comrades' final moments. They understood the consequences of mistakes instantly. Yet this also fueled vengeance and resolve, turning fright into fury. Word of a hidden tiger at the far end of a village could ignite an aggressive hunt by a whole company. The grief traveled fast. So did the response. Years after the war, commanders from both sides were interviewed about what truly determined victory. Guns mattered. Armor mattered. Training mattered. But again and again, American officers credited radios with tipping the balance in countless engagements. German officers, once reluctant to admit failings, eventually acknowledged that their communications weakness was a persistent wound. They had been lions with muted roars. The SCR-508, built into the Sherman as standard, weighed around 100 pounds with its power units. It was not sleek. It hummed and grew hot. The operator had to constantly fine-tune channels while inside a rumbling, shaking metal box. Yet its crystal-controlled FM signal was astonishingly stable. It gave every commander confidence that his warning or command would be heard not just vaguely, but clearly enough for action. In the din of battle, clarity is priceless. Even as the Allies neared victory in 1945, the Germans kept producing tanks capable of killing multiple Shermans in a single engagement. But a Panther surrounded by 5 Shermans dies. A Königsdeiger cut off from support burns like any other machine crushed by coordinated flanking. The Americans didn't need superiority in every duel. They made sure a duel almost never remained a duel. The radios expanded beyond the tanks themselves. New doctrines integrated ground spotters equipped with portable FM sets, infantry platoons connected by backpack transmitters, and artillery that listened for just one code word before unleashing roaring death on a detected enemy armor line. It was a symphony, and while the brass section might have been the tank guns, the conductor was the airwave whisperer hidden inside each vehicle. Every time a German tank caught fire and its turret blew skyward in a thunderous plume, the story told was that the Panzer had finally been outgunned or out-armored. That was rarely the full truth. More often, the story was that a Sherman spotted it first, told his friends where it hid, and struck with overwhelming simultaneous force. Radios gave the Americans the precious seconds needed to turn danger into destruction. In the end, the Americans learned something profound and permanent about future wars. The battlefield would never again be decided solely by armor thickness or cannon diameter. The winner would be the force that could best share information, best adapt in real time, best transform collective knowledge into unified action. This principle did not stay inside Europe's ruined villages. It followed the world into the Cold War, into Korea, into Vietnam, and far beyond. Modern armies today command networks that trace their origin directly back to those FM sets buzzing inside the Sherman's rattling frame. A veteran of Patton's Third Army summed it up years later with the simplicity of a man who had lived through hell and survived because his radio didn't fail. Our tanks talked. Theirs didn't. That's the whole war. By the time the war finally dragged itself to a halt in 1945, the Sherman tank had carved a reputation that history almost misunderstood. Countless films and documentaries romanticized the might of the German Tigers and Panthers, the thickness of their armor, the precision of their guns. Meanwhile, the Shermans were often portrayed as the underdogs, fragile and outmatched. Yet the soldiers who commanded them understood a deeper truth. Their greatest weapon had never been the gun that fired from the turret or the armor plates welded along the hull. Their authority did not come from steel, came from voices. Again and again, those radios bought time. They bought survival. They bought tactical brilliance where none should have existed. A Sherman might burn when struck by a Tiger's shell, but 10 more Shermans would already be moving to avenge it because someone spoke up across the net. The radios turned fear into direction, chaos into maneuver. They allowed leaders to command a battlefield they could not physically see, to make decisions based on shared awareness rather than isolated terror. When German commanders tried to understand why their superior tanks had failed to turn the tide, the answer was never comfortable. They had forgotten their own lesson from 1940, when German radios had overwhelmed Allied silence. They invested everything into perfecting the individual tank. Thicker armor, longer barrels, monstrous engines. They created giants. But giants, if deaf and alone, are easy prey. In countless dusty roads, muddy fields, and shattered towns, The Sherman's antenna stood tall like a banner of connection. If it broke, the crew repaired it immediately. If the radio sputtered, they tuned it relentlessly. Because the moment the airwaves went quiet, so did their lifeline. The tank became blind. It became terrified. It became just another target waiting to be found. When the war was studied afterward, historians pored over production numbers, kill ratios, mechanical reports. Some argued the Sherman only won through weight of numbers and logistical avalanche. There was truth in that. America's industrial might flooded the battlefield with more machinery than the Axis could ever hope to match. There is a quiet poetry in knowing that the most advanced advantage wasn't loud or spectacular. No sanderes roar. No dramatican baling. The Germans never truly saw it. The world barely acknowledged it. But the American tankers who survived would tell you exactly what happened. The Sherman wasn't weaker. It was smarter. And in war, the smarter army wins. The story of the Sherman's radio is a reminder that courage becomes unstoppable when it refuses to stand alone. That ordinary men inside a steel box can change history as long as they can hear each other's voices. And that sometimes the fate of nations rests not on who fires first or hardest, but on who communicates best. So the war ended. The giant tanks lay silent. Europe tried to rebuild from ashes. But the Sherman's most powerful invention stayed alive. It became the heartbeat of modern combat. It became the invisible thread tying armies together. It became the proof that technology doesn't just enhance war. Sometimes, when it works in service of unity, it helps bring the world back to peace faster than anyone expected. The men who rode those vehicles grew old, their radios replaced by something smaller, cleaner, digital. Yet they carried a memory that never faded. A simple, stubborn truth whispered through the airwaves as clearly as it had been in 1944. We survive together. We fight together. We win together. Because we can always hear each other.